Hi, I'm Tony Northrop, and this is my free 1-hour overview of the Canon T6i, my favorite little camera that is great at just about everything. I'm going to be going in depth into the camera, and if you have a different camera or you have a friend who has a different camera, visit sdp.io/tutorials and you'll see tutorials for just about every single major new camera out, going into the same level of detail. Notice I'm not going to cover every single thing about this camera. I skip over some things which are not fundamental to photography. Like I won't go into the specifics of how the Wi-Fi works because it's kind of frustrating and most people won't ever end up using it. However, I will cover all the stuff that's really important. And if you already know some of this, like you know how to put the lens on, check out the table of contents below and jump forward in the video to the parts that you need. You don't have to sit here and watch stuff that you already know. I'll cover the physical controls first for those of you kind of new to interchangeable lens cameras. I already have the lens attached, but to attach it the first time, you'll line up the white dot here on the lens with the white dot on the lens mount. If you use a full frame lens, it'll have a red dot and you'll line it up with that red mount. So we line up those two white dots and then we twist the lens clockwise until it clicks, and then I always wiggle it just to make sure it's nice and solid on there. Then you're ready to shoot. To get to the battery, you'll flip the switch here and it will pop open. The battery slides in with the contacts kind of towards you, towards the back of the camera, and when it slides in all the way, it will click. If you're traveling for more than like a day, you'll want to bring the battery charger with you so you can charge it overnight. If you're recording a lot of video or you're using live view, the screen on the back a lot, the battery might run out even faster, so it's always a good idea to bring that charger with you. This camera does not charge via USB, unfortunately. There's a memory card in there, which is like your digital film. So pull this slot here towards you and then flip it open like that to reveal the SD card. The SD card slides in and clicks in place, and to pull it out again, just push it. Whoops, push a little too hard, fired right out. So you push it until it clicks and then you can close that door. That's your digital film. You don't have to go buy an expensive SD card. Instead, I would choose an inexpensive, large SD card. If you plan to be shooting sports or wildlife, having a more expensive, faster card can help you take more consecutive shots quickly. So in that case, you might consider getting a faster card. Otherwise, just get a bigger, cheap card. The only other physical control that you really need to know about is this articulating screen. It flips out, and with this back here flipped outward, the screen itself is protected. So it's kind of like having a lens screen cover built in. You can pull it out to the side here, and that makes it easy to hold it over your head or to hold it down low to the ground. It's great for recording video that way. It's also good for selfies because you can flip it towards you and take pictures kind of with your thumb on the shutter button here like that. I usually just leave it out like this, unless I'm going to throw it in a bag or something. It's perfectly fine to leave it out. It won't be a big deal. To turn your camera on, you'll just flip the switch here from off to on. You don't need to always remember to turn the camera off. Some people freak out because they forgot to turn their camera off. It's not a big deal. It'll turn itself off automatically. In fact, I never take it out of the on position. I just leave it on all the time. It'll go to sleep. It won't burn through all the batteries and it won't catch on fire. You should be fine. There are a few ports I want to cover. Over here, the ports closest to the front of the camera, you have a mic port and then a port for the remote shutter timer. The mic port is, the camera has a built-in microphone, so it will record video with that. But the microphone will sound terrible. You always get, at best, mediocre sound, but never great sound. If you want a better sound, you could hook up a microphone to it, but you can easily spend more on a mic than you did on the camera. The remote shutter trigger here is useful for night photography, time lapses and such, stuff that we cover in chapter 10 of Stunning Digital Photography. The HDMI and USB ports are here. The HDMI port is mostly used for hooking the camera up to a TV if you just wanted to show your family your pictures that you'd taken on vacation and you didn't want to load them onto a computer. You could get a mini HDMI port to HDMI, a mini HDMI to HDMI cable and hook it up from your camera to your TV. The port on top here is a USB port, not used for charging, but it is used for unloading the pictures from your camera. However, it would be very slow to do that. You'll be happier if you get a USB 3 memory card reader and then just take your SD card out and put it into the memory card reader. That'll be faster. And most of the time it's easier too, and it doesn't use up your camera's batteries. Now let's talk about the process of actually taking a picture. Once you've got the camera on, in the on position there, you can just push the shutter button halfway and it will autofocus for you, and then push it all the way and it will actually take the picture. Then it automatically replays it for you. If you want to review the picture, hit the play button down here to the right of the screen, and that lets you review the picture, and then you can use the directional pad here to flip between the different pictures on the camera. While you're reviewing pictures, you can change the information that you see. So right now, you can see it's telling me how many pictures are on the card, and my battery status, and my camera settings down here, the shutter speed, the f-stop, the exposure compensation. If I hit the info button, it will change, and now it shows me a histogram, which is terribly useful. I'll cover it in Chapter 4 of Stunning Digital Photography. It basically tells you the brightness of the picture and lets you truly know whether the picture is properly exposed or not. You can't just look at the LCD screen, because the way that appears can change depending on how bright the room you're in is. Hit it again, and you see the picture itself with no distractions, and the info button. Pushing it again will continue to cycle through all the information that you can see. If you're reviewing a picture and you don't like it, just hit the delete button there, scroll over to erase, and then click set in the middle, and it will erase it. But I like that picture, so I'm not going to delete it. I'll go through the different camera modes and why you'd want to use each of them. When you get the camera, it's probably in the green auto mode, or maybe it's in the P program mode. And there are a bunch of modes here that I'm just not going to cover because, there's a little running guy here, and that's useful for sports. And if you don't understand shutter priority and aperture priority, you could use that without reading the manual. But I'm going to show you how to use the only modes you need, which are aperture priority, shutter priority, and manual mode. You can disregard everything else. We'll start with aperture priority because it's my favorite mode. Aperture priority gives you direct control over the aperture of the lens. That's the iris of the lens. Just like the iris in your eye, it gets small to let in very little amounts of light, or big to let in lots and lots of light. When it's big, you can take pictures in low light environments like after dark. And when it's little, you could get a longer shutter speed, for example, when you're shooting in bright light. Now, when the iris is little, there's another side effect that's very important to understand. It makes the background sharp and in focus. So the way aperture and f-stop numbers work can be kind of confusing because aperture is measured with f-stop. And as we look at the display here, you can see right now it's set to f8. So because I have the mode dial here in AV, aperture priority mode, aperture value, I can use the main dial here to change the f-stop number. So as I'm scrolling it to the left, it went from f8 all the way down to f3.5 with this kit lens. The lower f-stop numbers mean the iris itself is bigger. Confusing, right? The higher f-stop numbers mean the iris is getting smaller and smaller and letting less and less light in. So as I go all the way to f22, it's letting very little light in. The higher f-stop numbers mean the background is more sharp. So higher f-stop number, higher background sharpness. Lower f-stop number, lower background sharpness. So if you're taking a portrait and you want to blur the background, which would you do? You'd go for the lower f-stop number, right? If you're taking a picture of somebody in front of the Eiffel Tower and you want to see the tower nice and sharp, you'd pick that high f-stop number. Both of those you'd use aperture priority in. So we cover more in Chapter 4 of Stunning Digital Photography. Shutter priority is the mode you'll use for action. Things like sports and wildlife. Anytime where the amount of time the shutter is open is going to significantly change the picture. Now, a lot of people think a picture happens in an instant, but it's not an instant. There's a certain amount of time that it's open, and everything is moving during that period of time. So if you were to take a picture at 1/60th of a second, and I'm just standing here, it would look fine. It would look nice and crisp. But if I were running towards you and you took a picture at 1/60th of a second, I would be all blurry, and that could be really frustrating for sports photography. So in that situation, when somebody was moving, you'd change the camera to TV, which is time value or shutter priority, and then you would choose a faster shutter speed. So right now the camera's at 1/500th of a second, but if I move it to the right, it's going to go to higher and higher shutter speed. So now it's at 1/2500th of a second. Very small fraction of a second. This fast shutter speed would freeze motion, everything from a flying bird to a person running. Even if you go all the way up to the maximum shutter speed of 1/4000th of a second, you could freeze the wings of a hummingbird. It's very, very fast. However, you won't just simply pick 1/4000th for everything. So you'll always want to use the slowest shutter speed you can while freezing the effects of motion in your picture and while canceling out the camera shake. And again, Chapter 4 in SDP can help you pick the perfect shutter speed for different conditions. Until you get comfortable with that, you can always just switch to program mode or the green automatic mode here. So if any of this becomes overwhelming and you just want to get the shot, just switch back to one of these. But when you work through the practices and such, you'll begin to understand deeply which settings you should choose for different environments. Now, when you had it in aperture priority mode, the main dial here was controlling the f-stop number, the aperture. When you had it in shutter priority mode, it was controlling the shutter speed. What if you want to control both the aperture and the shutter speed? This is really common because you want to control the aperture to control the background blur, but you need to have a specific shutter speed to freeze motion or to cancel out camera shake. Well, you switch into manual mode, and manual mode gives you control over both those settings at the same time. So as I change the style over to M, now the main dial here still controls the shutter speed, just like it did in shutter priority. To change the aperture, hold down this AV button here, and then move the main dial. So as long as I have this button held down, it's going to affect the aperture instead of the shutter speed. Another way to change the aperture, if you forget about that little plus minus there, is to hit the Q button or to hit Q on the screen here. They both do the same thing. And this allows you to just touch to change the controls. So once I touch that, I can slide it up or down and select whatever f-stop I want. Bulb mode is a special mode mostly used for night photographers. Bulb mode can keep the shutter open for more than 30 seconds because by default, this camera will only keep the shutter open for 30 seconds. And sometimes if you're taking pictures and just outside in the woods at night, you might need to keep the shutter open for a minute or 2 minutes. Bulb mode allows you to do this. To use bulb mode on this camera, set the mode dial here to manual, and then scroll the shutter speed left. See, it's getting slower and slower. Now it's at 1/3 of a second. Now it's at 1 full second. And if I keep scrolling to the left, I'll get all the way to 30 seconds. Now if I scroll it left one more time, it switches to bulb mode. In bulb mode, the shutter will stay open for as long as you keep your finger on the shutter there. So I'll hold it down, and you can see it stays shut until I let go of the shutter. So you could keep your finger on here for 2 full minutes and get a great exposure at night, but if you did that, it would be really boring. And also, you would probably shake the camera a little bit because you'd be holding your finger there and you're human and you move and stuff. So what you're going to do instead is you're going to use the remote timer that we talked about, and I'll provide some specific recommendations for that in the night photography chapter of Stunning Digital Photography. Speaking of, I'll just give a quick plug. If you feel like getting SDP, my buying guide, which covers camera gear, or learning more about how to use Lightroom and Photoshop and post-processing and such, I have books covering all these topics. They're all mixed media books. They're all video books. So SDP here has over 12 hours of video integrated throughout the book, high quality video that helps you understand specific topics like which camera settings to choose. It makes it much easier. The buying guide answers all your questions about lighting, flash, which bodies to get, what kind of gear you need to get the pictures you want. And the Lightroom book helps you learn how to organize and edit your pictures. They all include hours and hours of video, free support groups, and updates about the relevant products. This book has been updated so many times. It started with 90 minutes of video, and now it has like over 13 hours of video. We've been updating it for years, and I'll keep updating it as long as I'm alive. Now let's talk about the different shutter modes on the camera. By default, when you turn on your camera and you hold the shutter down, it will just take one picture. Even if you just keep your finger on there, it will just take that one picture. Well, if somebody was running towards you and wanted to take a lot of pictures, it would be hard to take them fast enough, right? So what you'll end up doing instead, I'll switch this back to aperture priority mode, is you'll switch to a continuous shutter that will keep taking pictures as long as you have the shutter button here held down. So to do that, I will hit the shutter shortcut button here. It's on the left directional pad. It looks like a stack of copies. So I'll select that and then pick continuous shooting here. So now as I hold the shutter down, you hear that pretty fast frame rate. It will take pictures continuously. There are a few other shutter modes that are important to know about. First, you also have silent continuous shooting, and it's not at all silent, but it is quieter. So I'll select that. You can see the shutter now sounds different, and if you're taking pictures at a wedding or a funeral or something where you don't want to disturb people, maybe you're up close with birds and wildlife, that's a better mode to choose. There's a little more of a delay on the shutter, which is why it's a separate mode. There's a little bit of a disadvantage, but when you want to be stealthy, that's the way to go. Another mode that I find terribly useful is the self timer for a 2-second delay. If you're using your camera on a tripod and you want to get sharper pictures, set that 2-second delay. Now when I push the shutter button, it waits a couple of seconds before taking the picture. What that does is it lets the camera get rid of any shake caused by me pushing the shutter button. And yes, that's a significant source of camera shake that will cause your pictures to be a little less sharp. Would make a difference unless you had the camera on a tripod, however. Another shutter mode here is the self timer, 10 seconds. So when I set this, you know what this is for. It's for taking a picture with the camera and then running around and putting your arm behind your family and getting yourself in that self-portrait. There's another mode that's even better for these tripod selfies, and that's the self-timer continuous over on the far right. So you can see, you can dial up or down how many pictures you want to take once the self-timer goes off. So I'll set that to 10, and with that activated, it will count down for the full 10 seconds and then take multiple pictures, which is so useful because you know for the first 3 pictures, like Bobby's going to have rabbit ears up behind his sister, and you're going to have like a dirt face or something. But if you take 10 pictures, odds are good that one of them is going to be nice and sharp and everybody will be orderly. So it just means there's less running back and forth between your posing position and the camera itself. I'll also talk about focusing modes. So by default, when you focus, and I'll turn on live view here by pushing this camera icon. By default, when you press the shutter button halfway, the camera will lock focus and then freeze when it finds focus, and it won't focus anymore after that. So if the subject moves, or if you move the camera, it will stop trying to focus. And that's perfect for still subjects. It works really well. But if there's a moving subject, you'll want to switch to continuous focusing mode. That will try to chase the subject, continuously focusing on it. Sports, wildlife, even any kind of moving subject at all. It's a good way to go. To select the focusing mode, hit the AF button over on the right here of the directional pad. Turn off live view for that. And one shot means focus and then stop. That's perfect for using focus and recompose, as we discuss in Chapter 2 of Stunning Digital Photography. AI Servo is the mode you want for all your sports and wildlife. AI Focus, there's no need to use it. That lets the camera choose between the 2 modes, but now that we know what we're doing and how to use the focusing mode, you never have to worry about that automatic thing. Also talk about the focusing points a little bit. The camera has quite a few different focusing points, allowing it to focus in different parts of the frame. And I think the way I usually do it is to use a single focusing point. And I'll put that focusing point wherever I want it to focus. When you're taking a picture of a person, you always want to focus on the nearest eye. That will make the picture as engaging and sharp as possible. To change the focusing point, you'll hit this button up here in the upper right corner and use the directional pads to select which focusing point you want to use. You can also let the camera select the focusing point, and to do that, you'll push this button here. First, you'll push this button to bring up the focusing point display, and then you'll push this button here to the left of the ISO button. So as I push that, it will switch between 9 focusing points, where it will automatically select, and all the focusing points. And the only reason I ever use those 2 modes with multiple focusing points is when I'm focusing on a moving subject and I'm having a hard time keeping a single focusing point on that subject. So if you're taking pictures of a flying bird through a big telephoto lens, it's very hard to keep a single focusing point on a faraway subject. I'll switch to all the focusing points, and the camera will usually be better at finding the subject than I will be at keeping a single focusing point on there. But for all other situations, I pretty much use just a single focusing point, and usually continuous focusing with back button focus, which I'll show you in just a little bit. A little trick that I really like, just stay tuned for that. You can also manually focus your camera, even though it's almost never the right solution. Now, some people think all the pros must use manual focus because it's harder, but that's not true. Now, back in the film days, we used manual focus because, well, autofocus didn't exist, but also because our cameras had special systems that helped us manually focus, like split prism and ground glass viewfinders. Well, the modern DSLRs just don't have those systems, and as a result, manual focus is really difficult to be precise with. But you can manually focus. I'm just kind of warning you, it's not going to be as good as autofocus in most situations. To switch your lens here from autofocus to manual focus. And once you're in manual focus mode, you can just use the ring on the lens to manually focus, and you can see you can throw stuff in focus or out of focus. You can also use autofocus and then manually focus. So you don't have to, with most Canon lenses, you don't have to switch to manual focus to be able to manually focus. You can just grab the ring and go for it. If you want to manually focus and you want to be precise about it, turn on live view by hitting that button and then zoom in. So to zoom in, you'll hit this blue magnification button up here on the right. And you can see it's telling me that I have face tracking turned on. So to turn off face tracking, I'm going to hit the Q button, and you can see now it has face tracking selected. I'm going to just scroll to the right until I'm on a single focusing point. So now that I have a single focusing point selected, I can hit that magnification button to zoom in. And as I push it to zoom in multiple times, look, you can see each individual pixel in there. And I can manually focus and just make sure that I really nail focus. So that's really the only time when manual focus is going to be useful to you, when you've magnified it on live view, which requires you to turn off face tracking. I like face tracking, so I'm going to go ahead and go in and turn that back on by hitting the Q button. And then you can see the AF method there. I'm just scrolling to the left to turn on face tracking again. Face tracking only works in live view, and it's never as fast or precise as using the autofocus points that you see in the viewfinder. And that's a point I should have brought up earlier, but live view works well on this camera, and focusing works well on live view, but it never works as well as when you're using the viewfinder. So if you can't keep up with the subject, if the subject is moving fast, you'll always want to turn off live view and use the viewfinder. That focusing, what they call phase detect focusing, is always faster and more accurate. Now, I do want to briefly talk about the metering modes and how to select the different metering modes. But first, I'll tell you, just leave it at the default, because the default metering is perfect for every situation. I will show you later how to use exposure compensation to adjust when the metering isn't nailing it. But nowadays, we really don't have to worry about metering modes. It's something that was important in the film era, but not so important nowadays. If we hit this Q button here, which is key to changing a lot of different settings, we can scroll down to change the metering mode. It's this bottom center icon here. So as I select that, evaluating metering is the default, and I suggest you leave it at that. However, you can switch over to partial metering or spot metering. Partial metering looks at just a smaller part of the scene and uses that information to decide how the whole picture should be exposed. Spot metering looks at a tiny part of the scene and bases the entire exposure on that small part. And then center weighted average is just like a holdover from old Canon film cameras that you don't ever need to use. Evaluated metering looks at the center part of the scene and weights that with other information. So it looks at both the foreground and the background and tries to properly expose based on all of that. And it's pretty much always the best way to go. Now, besides aperture and shutter speed, there's another camera setting that affects the brightness of your pictures, and it's ISO. A lot of people say ISO, and that's okay, but it is not an acronym. It does not stand for International Organization of Standardization. It's just the word ISO, so that's how I say it. To change the ISO, there's a dedicated button on the top here. Just push that ISO button, and you'll see it'll pop up on the display and give you a choice of different ISOs. Most of the time, you can just leave it at auto ISO. And that means the camera will look at the scene and set the ISO depending on the amount of light that you have and what it actually needs. That works great most of the time. Once you get deep into chapter 4 of stunning digital photography and you're like, oh, I now understand it and I want to take control and maybe I want to always use ISO 100 to make sure I get the cleanest images, push that ISO button and then you can go in and manually select the ISO that you need. But until then, auto ISO works pretty well for you. Now let's talk about exposure compensation. Earlier when I told you didn't have to sweat the metering, I'm sure there were some old film guys who were like, oh, metering is very important, and it is. But the way you adjust it nowadays, at least the way I find easier, is to use exposure compensation. So basically, exposure compensation tells your camera, hey, I want this picture to be a little brighter than you think or a little darker than you think. If you take a picture and it's too dark, you'll dial in a stop or 2 stops of exposure compensation. If it's too bright, you'll dial in -1 stops or -2 stops of exposure compensation to make it darker. Each stop is a doubling or a halving of the light. And if you make a picture 1 stop brighter, it's like 1/8 brighter. So that's the way it kind of looks to your eye. To use exposure compensation on this camera, set it to program, shutter priority, or aperture priority modes. Then you can use the exposure compensation button here. Hold that down and dial the main dial here to the right or to the left. So now you can see it's set to -1 stops, -2 stops, +1 stops, +2 stops. To demonstrate this, I'll turn on live view, and you'll be able to see the effects in real time when you have live view on. I'll hold down that exposure compensation dial and dial it to the right, and you can see the screen just gets brighter and brighter. As I dial it to the left, the screen will get darker and darker. So if you were reviewing a picture and it were too dark, you would know you'd want to add in 1 or 2 stops. And in fact, this is too dark because I want those whites to be nice and white, and they're actually kind of gray. So I would just keep dialing up the exposure compensation until they got nice and bright and white. Oh, that's too bright. So there we go, about +2 stops of exposure compensation gives me a perfect picture of this screen. Now, live view is really useful because it shows you the exposure before you actually take the picture. If you want to see more information like the histogram, hit the info button up here when you have live view on. So now I can see the histogram here. And it's a great way to understand the histogram is to experiment with this. So I'll hold down this exposure compensation button here, and as I dial the main dial to the left, you can see the screen gets dimmer, but the histogram also moves to the left. When the histogram is in the middle here, that means just about everything in the picture is some shade of gray. If I want it to be white, represented by the right side of the histogram, I just got to dial that exposure compensation up, and now we can see we have bright whites and dark blacks. Just a perfect exposure. When you're done, always reset the exposure compensation back to 0. If you don't, the next time you pick up your camera, it'll still be set, and then you'll end up taking a picture that's too bright or too dark. So just always reset back to 0. It's a good thing to do in general. Now we'll discuss bracketing. Bracketing is another kind of holdover of the film era. Back in the old days, if you were shooting film, you would have to take a picture, develop it, and then print it, and then you might realize, oh, I printed this, I underexposed this picture, or I overexposed this picture. But it would be like days later, and you wouldn't be able to go back and get the picture. So what we would do is we would take multiple pictures at different exposures. We'd take a picture that we thought was too dark, a regular picture, and then a picture we thought was too bright. And that way, even if we screwed it up, we'd have one picture that was good. Well, this camera still supports bracketing, and it's still useful. We can now see immediately if we overexpose it and correct that. But bracketing is useful for taking HDR pictures, high dynamic range pictures, which I cover in Chapter 11 of Stunning Digital Photography. I just want to show you how to turn it on this camera. So I will hit the menu button here. And on camera 2, the second icon here, the very top option says Expo Comp/AEB. It's got to be the worst labeled menu item ever. AEB stands for Auto Exposure Bracketing. I wish that just said bracketing. It doesn't for whatever reason. If I select it here, now I can adjust the bracketing. So this top dial here is actually the amount of exposure compensation you have dialed in. So you'll just see that reflected. But to adjust the bracketing to take multiple pictures, now I'll use the main dial, and you can see these red indicators show you where it will be taking a picture. So now it's taking a picture at 1 stop underexposed, properly exposed, and 1 stop overexposed. I find it more useful just to rack that out to the extreme, which is 2 stops underexposed, a regular picture, and 2 stops overexposed. After you do that, don't just hit the shutter button to leave. You have to hit the set button to make it remember it. If you forget to hit the set button, it will just forget that you set up bracketing, and then you won't actually take bracketed pictures. And I always go back. I always do that. That's why I'm warning you about it. I do it like 3 times. So now that I have bracketing enabled, I'll just show you how it works. I'll turn on live view here, and I'll take a picture of the screen. You can see it took 3 pictures consecutively when I pushed the shutter once. Overexposed picture, an underexposed picture, and a properly exposed picture. You do have to hold the shutter button down while it takes all 3 pictures. Just remember to hold the shutter button down for a little bit. Now the camera also has an HDR mode, but for the most part I don't use it because it's rather slow. Instead I would just use bracketing and then blend the pictures using HDR software on my computer. Also with HDR mode, sometimes you'll just get pictures that just look terrible, and then it's too late. You can't go back and retake it. I'd much rather bracket it and be able to control it on my computer later. It's a philosophical thing, but that's the way I prefer to work. This camera has a built-in flash, and it's really useful for adding a little bit of light to the subject, filling in some shadows on the face, or of course, if it's just too dark. To turn the flash on, just hit the flash button here. Now, these little on-camera flashes are notorious for just giving terrible lighting. They will just blind your subjects and make their faces way too bright. You can address a lot of that by using flash exposure compensation, which just turns the flash up or down. But pretty much what I'll always do when I use one of these is set the flash exposure compensation to like -1 stop or so. So to use flash exposure compensation, turn the flash on. Then if you hit the Q button here, you can scroll over to the flash exposure compensation setting here in the second row all the way to the right. So as I select that, I can now use the main dial to move the flash exposure compensation up or down. So if I set it to -2 stops and take another picture, it's just going to put out significantly less light, 1/4 the light at -2 stops. So I'll hit that again and just set it to my favorite, which is about -1. -1 or -1 1/3. And that means it won't blind your subjects quite as much. The light in the foreground will be better balanced with the light in the background. But at the end of this video, I will suggest getting an external flash that doesn't cost much, but will just make the flash look so much better by allowing you to bounce the light off the ceiling, fill the whole room. It means your people won't be blinded and the background won't be completely dark either. Another setting you probably don't have to worry about is white balance, but I do want to mention it because it's something people think about a lot. Your brain sees a white book or a white table as white, whether it's under sunlight or whether it's under an incandescent light or a fluorescent light. But your brain is actually lying to you. Your brain knows what kind of light you're under and adjusts it so it looks the same in different lighting conditions. Your camera will do the same thing. It's called auto white balance. It's kind of a feature because you might not notice it, but fluorescent lights are a little bit green and incandescent lights are quite yellow. LED lights tend to be a little bit blue. When it's full sun, well, we call that daylight balance, and that's kind of, we all consider that to be the true white. But if it's a cloudy day, everything gets a little bit bluer. And during the sunset, during the sunrise, things can get a little bit orange. Your camera will try to adjust for this automatically. And if you shoot RAW files, which I'll discuss in a little bit, you can change the white balance perfectly. But sometimes people want to take control of the white balance, and it's, again, not something you have to worry about too much, but I do want to show you if you want to take control of it, there's a WB button here on the directional pad. Push that, and then you can scroll to the white balance that's appropriate for the situation that you're in. So AWB is auto white balance, but if you're shooting in full sun, you could set it to daylight. If you're in the shade, set it to the shade, cloudy day, etc. And that'll make sure that the colors on your camera are just right. If you take pictures and they're too orange or they're too blue, it's probably a white balance problem, and that's how you can manually fix it. This camera, and most cameras, have a diopter, which is basically like building in your glasses prescription into the viewfinder. And if you're a glasses wearer and you want to take off your glasses and use it, that can make life so much easier because it's terrible to try to hold this little thing up to your glasses and push it against your face. It hurts your nose and everything. So instead, you can take your glasses off and have perfect vision when you're looking through the camera. To adjust it, you'll hold it up to your eye and then adjust this little dial here up or down. So you want to make sure the camera's on so you can see those numbers at the bottom of the screen, and then dial it in until they're nice and crisp and sharp. Now, if you share the camera between multiple people, it'd just be kind of frustrating if you had the diopter set to one of your prescription, because then anybody else who looked through it would find it blurry. I also want to note that if you ever look into your viewfinder and everything is blurry, it's that diopter, just so you know where it is. People think their camera's like out of focus or it's broken or something. Just look through it, dial that up or down until everything is nice and crisp and sharp. I discussed live view a little bit already, but live view shows you what your camera is currently seeing. You activate it by pushing the camera icon here on the back. And it's terribly, terribly useful. First, it can show you a histogram. It can show you how bright or how dark your picture is going to be. It also allows you to flip out that articulating screen and hold it like that and actually hold it over your head or hold it down low to the ground for interesting angles. To change what you see on the display, you can just hit the info button here. Now it's hiding all that annoying info. Now you see just your exposure compensation and your current aperture. Push it again. It's now telling me the flash exposure compensation, and it's giving me shortcuts for some other settings. as I accidentally demonstrated, you can touch the screen and it will focus on that part of the picture and immediately take a picture of it. I find that really convenient. Works just like a cell phone, basically. Hit the info button again, and you'll see your histogram, which shows you your the brightness of the picture. I love having a touchscreen on the camera just for that purpose. It makes it so easy to quickly focus and take a picture. Video is activated by switching the on-off switch over to the video camera here. This camera records great video. 1080p, 60 frames a second, does a decent job of autofocusing, but not a great job. To start recording video, hit the camera button just like when you're switching into live view, and it will start to record video. Most of the time with this camera, you're going to want to focus before you start shooting. However, you can hold the shutter button halfway and it will autofocus for you. You can also do things like adjust the exposure compensation while you're recording. So it's good to get your settings dialed in before you start shooting, because as a viewer, it's annoying to see the settings change. But if you are already recording, it's never too late to go in and adjust those settings. There are a couple of settings that you might want to change for video. I'll just show you where they are. You probably don't have to change them, but I'll hit the menu button here. And now we see a couple of extra menu items that are active in video mode. The AF method, by default, it will do face tracking, which is usually fine. It'll track things other than faces too. Movie servo AF is okay to leave enabled. On the second video camera icon here, you see you can change the movie recording size, and by default it's set to full HD, which is 1080p and 30 frames a second, or 2997. On the second movie settings page, you can change the recording size and whether or not you're recording sound, but the recording size by default is not the best quality, and you should just leave it at that generally. The sound recording, if you hook up an external mic, you'll want to turn auto off. If you're using in-camera audio, auto is fine, but an external mic, you'll generally want to set it to manual and then adjust it up or down depending on how much input is coming in from the mic. So just so it's not, like, if you're seeing red lines in here, that means it's peaking and it's going to sound bad, but you usually want the levels to be kind of in this middle area, coming up to about where the green icon there is. Otherwise, you might need to adjust it up even further if it's not hitting that, or down even lower if it's peaking a lot. Now let's talk about formatting a memory card. The SD card in here can last you a really long time, but at some point you'll want to put that into your computer, unload all your pictures, and free it up by formatting it, basically cleaning the slate so you can reuse it. To format the memory card, hit the menu button here, and then go over to the wrench icons, and on the first wrench icon, about 4 down, is Format Card. Select that, and it warns you it's going to delete everything. Go ahead and scroll over and hit OK, and then it will format the card and free up all that space for you. If you accidentally format your card, don't take any more pictures. You can still recover all those pictures by putting your SD card into your computer and using a free tool called Photo Rec. This free tool works just as well as any paid tool, so don't go buy it, because when you search for it on the internet, you'll get bombarded with people wanting 30 or 60 bucks for an app. Photo Rec will scan the card and recover your pictures for free, but if you take any more pictures, you'll be overwriting those remnants of the photos. Chapter 5 of Stunning Digital Photography has detailed instructions, as does my Lightroom book. Now I'm going to go over a couple of recommended settings for using this camera. This is how I set it up, my favorite ways to use it. First, maybe the most important thing, is to turn off that beep. Oh, the beep can be so disturbing, especially as a wedding photographer, man. There's always Aunt Beatrice with her camera, and the whole time you're in this quiet church and the ceremony is going on, and you just hear beep, 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 beep. So please, you know when it's in focus, you don't need to hear the beep. Let's turn that off and not disturb the people around us. To turn off the beep, go to the first camera icon here, the second option down, hit that, and then switch from enable down to disable. And thank you for turning that off. On that same menu, right above it, is the image quality. And here you can switch from taking JPEG pictures to taking RAW pictures. The difference is that the default here is RAW, and that's a compressed format. It's easy to share, it doesn't take up much space, but it's actually throwing away a lot of the scene, a lot of the details and dark shadows like my jacket, or highlights in a very bright sky. When you take it as a JPEG, those will just look white or completely black. But when you take it as a RAW, you can actually go in an app like Lightroom or a free app, Picasa, and recover those shadows so you can see that detail, or pull that sky down so the sky is blue instead of white. It's so amazing once you start playing with RAW. To turn it on, you'll just go into that first menu item and switch from JPEG to RAW. And your pictures will take up more space. But if you use Picasa Free or Lightroom, it will process those pictures and allow you to easily share the JPEGs. And otherwise, you won't really notice any difference. It really doesn't make your life any worse, and it just makes it easier to edit. And even if you're not editing your pictures now, I would start shooting RAW, because a couple of years from now, you might suddenly get into Lightroom and you'll realize you want to go back and edit those pictures from now. And you'll be so glad that you're shooting RAW. Anyway, there's detailed information in Chapter 4 of Stunning Digital Photography. I just wanted to show you where that setting actually was. Now I'm going to show you how to use back button focus, which I also cover in Chapter 4. Back button focus decouples focusing from your shutter button. Instead, you'll activate back button focus by hitting this button here. And what this allows you to do is to take pictures without having the camera autofocus all the time. And it's surprising how useful that can be. For example, if you're taking night photography, you often need to autofocus on a subject, but then you want to take multiple pictures of it without refocusing every time, because focusing is difficult at night. So you turn it off, and then when you don't want to focus, you just don't push the button. It also means you can leave your camera in continuous focusing mode and never have to use one-shot AF. Even when you need to refocus and recompose, you just hold that button down until the camera focuses, and then you can let go and refocus without changing focusing modes. So it takes a little bit of practice to get good at coordinating your thumb and your index finger for taking pictures. But once you get accustomed to back button focus, it changes your photography and helps out so much. To turn on back button focus on this camera, hit the menu button, and then we need to go over to the custom functions. You can see it's under the fourth wrench icon here, the second item down, custom functions. So I'll select that, scroll through all these options until you get to item 10, and then scroll down and select it, and then select AE/AF. And that means that button is now going to autofocus for you. Now that you've got that turned on, you'll have to autofocus by pushing that. It will take you a couple of days of getting used to, but once you start using it, you won't go back, I swear. I will say that it can be confusing to anybody else who picks up your camera, because most people aren't used to using it. But if you put the camera back into the green mode there, it'll go back to autofocusing using the shutter button. So anytime you hand a camera to somebody else, just put it in that green mode. There's also a really useful feature called My Menu, because there are a lot of menu items here and it can be hard to find everything. So I like to put my most frequently used menu items on My Menu, which is this last menu item here, the little star. So select that and then select My Menu settings, and now you can register to My Menu. And now you scroll through all of this to select the menu item that you're using the most. So for me, the one I use the most is Format, which is somewhere in here. These are like in the order that they are in the menus, but it can be really hard to find the menu item you want. But the good news is, once you do find it, you won't have to go back all that frequently for it. It'll be easy to find in the future. Format card. So I'll select that, select OK to register it, and maybe you use Wi-Fi a lot and you want to turn on Wi-Fi. So with those two registered, I'll hit menu to go back, and now we can see those two menu items are always on the last menu, just really easy for me to access, so I don't have to dig through all those menus. Now I'll go over a couple of lenses, a tripod, and a flash, my favorite accessories for the T6i. The first lens I recommend for everybody is the Canon 50mm f1.8. There are a few different versions of this lens, and they're all good. The latest one is the STM version, and it's my favorite. It's a little quieter, it focuses a little bit smoother, and the image quality is a tiny bit better. You can pick one up at sdp.io/C50STM. They're only about 125 bucks. If you use my link, I get a few pennies out of every dollar. It just helps to pay for these videos. If you want better image quality, get the Sigma 18-35 f1.8, and you will be blown away. Now, it's expensive at $800, and it doesn't have the range of your big 18-35 or 18-135, but it's so much sharper. It's so much sharper that you will not be able to believe it. It also gathers like 4 or 6 times more light than your kit lenses, meaning you can use it in lower light. You'll get cleaner images. You can get great background blur out of it. It's just all around the best lens you can get for this camera. it produces professional results. I wouldn't hesitate to use this to shoot things like the event portion of a wedding. It makes your camera into a pro camera. Pick it up at sdp.io/s35. And I feel like I should mention, because I just went on for so long, we're not sponsored. We don't have any relationship with Sigma except for just a customer. We review a lot of gear, and that lens just really blows me away, so I always recommend it. Another Sigma lens that I really like for portraits, once you get that 50, you'll get 50mm f1.8. You'll be able to get good background blur out of that, but at some point, you want to be able to switch between like body shots and tight headshots quickly, and you need a zoom for that. The Sigma 50-150 f2.8, the image stabilized version, unfortunately is no longer made, but it's still the best lens available for this type of camera. So you might be able to find a used or refurbished copy at sdp.io/s150, or you might check someplace like eBay. If you can't find one, the Tamron 70-200 f2.8 is also a great option for more high-end portraiture. If you get into sports and wildlife, this lens simply can't be beat. It's the 400mm f5.6. I definitely recommend finding a used copy of this, though the new copies are still good. It's so durable that you could use this lens for 10 years and it will still be in like new condition, because it's a solid block of metal and it's completely sealed up. So it's an extremely durable. This lens is probably at least 10 years old. I bought it used. They go for about $1,000 used, or $1,100 used, or about $1,350 new, but it provides professional level wildlife photography at a great price. Now, you can spend more on wildlife lenses. You can get a zoom, you can get a lens with IS, but this, after testing everything, is still the lens that I recommend the most, especially for people's first lens. You can pick it up at sdp.io/C400, first wildlife lens. Let me just say, if you get the 75-300, which is what everybody starts with, you will be frustrated. All your pictures will be blurry, and this will solve that. They will give you sharp pictures. I'm also going to suggest a flash, because as I mentioned, this flash is kind of a bummer. It makes everybody look washed out and blinds them. If you get any flash that bounces off the ceiling will help, but the Canon flashes are wildly, wildly overpriced. So the one I recommend for Canon is the Yongnuo YN568EX2. For $125, it's about as powerful as the $600 top-end Canon flash. And it will just create the same results. It makes just the same pictures, just a better value because it's a knockoff. Go to sdp.io/YN568EX2. I'm also going to suggest a tripod. Tripods are really important for your group selfies, but also for night photography. You can spend $500-600 on a tripod, no problem, but this is a good starter tripod at $50. The Dolica GX600B200. Go to sdp.io/tripod1 to pick it up from Amazon. I love that hook in the center. You can hang your bag from it. It makes the whole tripod more stable and heavier. Even if you end up getting a higher end tripod later, you'll still keep this for travel because it's kind of small and lightweight. And one last plug, learning materials, educating yourself about photography is going to make way more of a difference in the pictures you take than buying more lenses or gear. You should get good at mastering light and emotion and mood and posing and expression, composition. All these things are the fundamentals of art, and they make way more difference than the camera's buttons and settings and lenses and flashes. I would rather you learn how to use light and mood and keep the camera in automatic mode the whole time. You'll get better pictures than if you just figure out all the camera settings but never study the art. So for all of that, check out my book, Stunning Digital Photography. It has over 12 hours of video to help you out, integrated throughout the book. It has quizzes that will help reinforce the lessons you've just read. It has practices that will get you real-world, hands-on experience with your camera. And you can join a Facebook group where you can get feedback from myself and something like 15,000 other active readers who are in the process of learning photography. Everybody's nice and supportive. If you get into organizing and post-processing your pictures, and you'll want to, once you get about 100 pictures and you can't find the one you're looking for, you realize you need a tool to organize your pictures. And Lightroom, Adobe Lightroom, is the tool I recommend. The book there on your left, my Lightroom book, has over 12 hours of videos in it. You can treat it like an entire video training course and never read the book if you want, or you can read the full book and get even better results out of it. A great way to do cropping and fixing exposure and working with your raw files. If you want more information about lenses and flashes and tripods and what all that means, If you want more than just my high-end recommendations, I have a whole book on it. It's a big fat book with more than 16 hours of video, my photography buying guide. You can pick all these up on Amazon. You'll see lots of reviews. This book has more than 1,000 reviews from people. Or you can go right to my store and get them for a little bit cheaper. Go to sdp.io/store. The ebooks are only $9.99. The paperback books are all like $19.99, and we ship worldwide. If you have any questions, go ahead and write a comment down below, and we'll try to get back to you. And don't forget to share with your friends. Send them to sdp.io/tutorials, where we have tutorials for all these different cameras. Thanks so much, and subscribe for free videos, because this YouTube channel has three new videos every week. Thanks.